Hello everyone. This video is going to be a little bit different than my last few. I'm going to just be talking about a deck and not showing any gameplay footage for it. If that's what you're here for, my next video should have plenty of gameplay footage. But I felt like it was reasonable to talk about why Sportsmetal is all the rage and sort of what makes it tick and how you could maybe think about trying to beat it. So we've all seen Precision Design, which plays like a regular Corp deck. It uses agendas, ice, and upgrades to then go and score those agendas, and it'll use operations to do extra efficiency or in some way fork the runner. Sportsmetal, as it exists right now, is very kind of counter to that. I'm going to make a little puzzle that you have to break fast enough, and switch that over to a different kind of game plan. So Sportsmetal has emerged as one of the top two meta decks in the format right now. Last year, Sportsmetal took the first place. It won. And this list is going to look in some ways very similar to the list we're going to be talking about, and in other ways very dissimilar to the ones we're going to be talking about. So part of why Sportsmetal came to be good is part of this cycle of metagame of good and bad decks. When Nisei released the 21.05 update, 3 of these sort of orthogonal corp decks just completely disappeared from the meta. And so initially it seemed like the only way corps were going to win was installing agendas behind ice and scoring them out, or using some kind of wide asset game plan. And so that meant that this version of 419 or 419 shell like this became essentially the best runner deck. It had been basically the best runner deck in 2020 or something very similar to it. And it had maybe fallen down in power a little bit relative to something like Hivemind Max. But many good players were arguing that with 21.05, 419 was a better deck than Hivemind Max and may have been even before that. And the reason was because it could basically play as close to as possible like 45 cards that was just money and breakers. And it could play so much money. Bravado, Career Fair, Deuces, Diesel, Dirty Laundry, Falsified, Sure Gamble, Penny Shaver, Daily Cast, Earthrise Hotel, The Class Act, and Rozeki. Those are all money cards, and there's like 4, 5, 6 different cards I skipped. So almost your entire deck is about getting a consistent amount of draw, a consistent amount of money, and just making a lot of individual value out of runs. Cards like Amakua are great in 419 because 419 requires 419, if you haven't played a lot of standards, says whenever the first time each turn the corp installs a card, they must you may expose that card unless the corp pays 1. And so if that would be the case, Amakua would then get a counter, so the corp has to pay 1 credit to stop this universal AI breaker from breaking everything. And this is a huge part of Criminal's early pressure right now. It means that decks that want to ice up and score behind, score out agendas behind ice with upgrades and whatever, have to work a lot harder, and 419 is going to get a lot of incidental accesses while that game is going on, and will eventually find a way to convert those incidental accesses into a win. 419 makes a lot of sense if the meta is full of corp decks that want to score from score off of the board, because you get to just outvalue them because you have so many value cards in your deck, and you have diversion of funds at just the right time to disrupt the corp's plans for scoring, and you have turning wheel to close it out. But if we were instead trying to design a deck, and I'll call this hypothetical deck a fair fast advanced deck, with an understanding that fair is a loaded term, but I'm just going to use it for now. 419's game plan would be essentially the same. It would be, I'm going to use diversion to stop the corp from ever getting enough credits, and I will start single accessing R&D every turn so that the corp doesn't have the clicks to draw, and they can't draw their agenda and then score it all in the same turn. So either I'll find it in R&D or I'll find it in HQ, and I'll use Amakua to keep making my stuff very efficient. But we see Sportsmetal starts to change that. One of the big threats when you're trying to do a fast advance plan as the corp is you need to find your agendas before the runner does. This is true generally. With fast advance, it's often the case that you cannot make a server that the runner cannot get into eventually. That's just not the goal of your deck. Your goal is often very rarely to, you'll try and get one or two agendas out early behind ice in many cases, but then your goal is to close out with a couple of agendas that you're scoring from hand with no intention to protect them long term. So if the runner is able to find that agenda, they access a single card in RD, it's an agenda, you're kind of stuck. Sportsmetal makes it so that you're not stuck. When the runner steals, you can draw 2 cards to go further into your deck. Or if you need money because you're against 419 and they've been playing Diversion, you can gain 2 credits. So this is a really valuable ability. Also, because this ability triggers when scored or stolen, when you score your own agendas, you'll get more forward tempo as Sportsmetal to go and fast advance the next time. So that's sort of where you start to think about Sportsmetal. Then we start to look at the agendas that are available to these Sportsmetal decks. So the very first one I'm going to talk about is, and almost all of these were legal. There's only one new gateway agenda that's going to play in the deck. But probably the most important agenda to this deck is also one that this deck rarely scores, though it changes a little bit depending on exactly what flavor of Sportsmetal you're on. But Project Vacheron, basically, all the Sportsmetal decks right now are putting in 2. The ones in 2020 were often putting in 3. But the release of Luminal Transubstantiation, which we'll get to in a moment, is sort of the difference maker for this deck and allows you to only run 2 Vacherons. The interesting thing about Vacheron is because most Sportsmetal games are only going to go to about 10 turns. If the runner accesses 20 unique cards over the course of the game with 2 Vacherons on the deck, that's only a 50% chance or so of finding one of them. And you have to, if the game ends on turn 5, the runner probably has to steal a Vacheron by turn 5. And so I chose the 20 accesses because that's if the runner was only running and always accessed a brand new card, they would still only have a 50% chance of accessing and stealing the Project Vacheron. So this makes this deck incredibly safe. Basically, as the corporation player, you're playing with only 14 agenda points that the runner can steal in your deck. But just wait, it gets even better. We have Mega Pre-qualifiers. This is 3 points in your deck for the runner to steal, but it's effectively 5 potential points for you to score. So now instead of playing a 20-point versus 20-point game, we're playing a 16 points for the runner and a 22-point game for us as the corp. And that's really valuable because we're going to be looking to fast advance a lot. We're going to try and score probably 4 agendas to win the game. And the Mega Pre-Fall qualifier gives us 2 to 3 more agendas that we're happy to score to help us get on that game-winning game plan. We also have the one new gateway agenda that Sportsmetal is playing, which is Luminal Transubstantiation. The cool thing about this is you get to score your agenda and then take a whole turn as if you hadn't just scored an agenda. And this is really nice in Sportsmetal because we'll have also gained 2 credits or drawn 2 cards. Yeah, it's a bit of a bummer we can't score again, but it's still so much value to basically take 2 turns in one. As if you think about an average Sportsmetal game, which is going between 6 and 10 turns, this basically gives the corp a whole extra turn, which is a lot. Hopefully that's somewhat obvious. Then you have Hyperloop extensions, which is a very nice card to just install naked on the table. If the runner goes and steals it, it basically becomes a Rashida for you, where it gets you 3 credits, and then you can draw 2 cards off of it. That's really good for a single click to install. If the runner doesn't steal it, at some point in the future, you can spend your turn and score it, and it pays for itself and then also gives you an ID trigger. So it's a very good win more card, and it's only worth 1 point if the runner steals it. You are planning to score 4 agendas anyway, so Hyperloop Extension can be one of those 4, and then as long as the rest of your other agendas are 2-pointers, you don't mind the hiccup at all. And finally, we have Project Vitruvius. And this is mostly played as a blank 3-2, but there are situations where the hosted agenda counter to pull a card back from archives is really valuable. So this is the blankest agenda in your deck, probably the least valuable agenda, the LVA or LVP, but it's still pretty good. And that's part of why this Sportsmetal list is so good. You get to run 12 agendas, and all of them you're happy to see, and basically all of them except the Vacherons, you're happy to have the runners steal. So this is part of why the Sportsmetal is so good. It has a really good agendas. In particular, Vacheron, I think, is the card that puts it over the edge. And I personally am starting to think that this was the problem to a lot of Sportsmetal decks, not other tools that have been banned sort of in the past. But here are our 12 agendas. How are we scoring them? Every deck does need a scoring plan or some way to win the game. The way these decks win the game is by playing Biotic Labor. So you play Biotic Labor, advance 3 times because you now have 4. Install the card and then advance it 3 times. That's 4 clicks. Biotic Labor gave you that extra click. We'll run 3 of those, and then every Sportsmetal list is running at least 2 and often 3 Audacities, which is a huge influence sink, but it allows the corp to just keep scoring, right? Instead of paying 4 credits, we pay 0 credits, and we get the 2 advancements off. So this is 6 credits cheaper than Biotic Labor. The downside, of course, is that there has to be at least 3 cards in HQ. That includes Audacity when you play this. But again, Sportsmetal will help us draw back up after we score with Audacity so we can keep going again. So I'm just sort of trying to build up the core of the deck, and then I'll show 2 different variations on this deck. So you have 3 Audacities, and then Spin Doctor is actually a core card in this deck because you want more card draw, and it helps you deal with your Vacherons. If you draw them early, you can overdraw and then use Spin Doctor to very safely shuffle those Vacherons back into R&D so that the runner doesn't really get access to them. Sprint does basically the same thing, and you want Sprint and Spin Doctor because it's really key that you line up one of your fast advance tools, Audacity or Biotic, with one of your agendas. So you want all of the card draw available to you, and Sprint and Spin Doctor are some of the best card draw options available in the game right now. The last good card draw option for you is Red Level Clearance. The cool thing about Red Level Clearance is it can clicklessly draw you a card. You spend the 1 credit, draw 2 cards, gain the click back, which just opens up a lot of possibilities. And so these 27 cards basically form the core of the deck. And the very interesting thing when we think back to this 419 list is we don't care now if 419 steals 1 or 2 or 3 agendas. It's very hard to plot a path here that allows the 419 player to reliably win on stealing 4 or sometimes even 5 agendas, right? There's only 4 2-pointers in the list, so, he could steal 3 of the 2-pointers and any one other non-Vacheron agenda. But if he doesn't do that, he's probably stuck stealing 5 or 6 agendas, and there often aren't enough clicks to turn the unreliable accesses into agenda scores. And he has no way of stopping us, if we're playing sports, from just scoring from hand. There's no tools in his deck to go and handle that. And so what we see that NWE and Snare Bears did when they were trying to make this deck is go 2 different paths. NWE said, well, let's get some really good ice in this list. We are going to drop an Audacity so that we can play some really good cards like IP block and predictive plan, or basically so that they can get the IP block. So they're going to run 6 barriers, 5 code gates, and 3 sentries just to make the runner actually go and get the breakers. But none of these cost more than 4 credits, and none of them are good like long-term taxing ice. But with this, by running this ice, what they can also do is put in Rashida Jaheim, which I sort of mentioned earlier. But Rashida basically is going to allow you to turbo draw through your deck. And so they also added in predictive planograms to get even more card draw into this list. And so, you know, again, we have the same core, the agendas, the fast advance operations, and the draw cards. And then for NWE, they wanted to go with ice to make it so that the runner does have to, instead of just running, you know, I talked about, if they got 20 random accesses, they would have 50% chance of stealing the Project Vacherons in time. As soon as you start installing ice, you're taking away those clicks from the runner because they now have to go and find the correct breaker to go and beat your piece of ice to then go and get that random access. The other thing it allows them to do is they can cut one Audacity and try and just score their agendas behind a piece of ice, which is a very nice and, you know, good, healthy part of Netrunner. The Snare Bears went a different direction and said, ice sucks, let's play anything else we can. And so they went down to only 5 ice. I think they went down to 0 and then went back up to 5. And, you know, I suspect that the right list is going to be somewhere as a compromise between these two lists. So what did Snare Bears gain by cutting all their ice, and what did they lose by cutting all their ice? Well, you'll note they can't run Rashida because there's nothing to stop the runner from checking every installed card. Now, there is actually some reason runners won't do that because A, you don't have to install agendas out until you score them in this list, and 2, the runner running a Hyperloop extension is generally pretty bad for the runner. They're going to have to, you know, they have to steal a lot of Hyperloops and a lot of the other agendas in the list before the downside of Hyperloop being a agenda starts to matter for the Corp. And so for the Corp, you just get the Rashida effect. And so instead, what the Snare Bears did was they put in Jeeves. Jeeves is a weird card, but basically it's really nice here because if you play 3 operations in the same turn, you get a 4th click. And Snare Bears was like, oh, hey, well, I can use red level to clicklessly play an operation. I can use subliminal message to clicklessly play an operation. I can play lateral growth to play an operation and install the agenda I care about. And all of a sudden, I have 4 clicks, or I have 3 clicks remaining on a 3-card combo with Jeeves installed, which sounds ludicrous to start, but ends up being somewhat reliable. With Jeeves, you open up a lot of lines, and you allow your fast advance tools to get stretched in lots of weird and wacky ways. It becomes possible to score a Project Vacheron from hand if you sequence your plays correctly. It also makes it so that you can sprint, draw cards from your deck, and still score out. You can, if you like lateral growth and then biotic labor or audacity, Jeeves will give you the extra click back you spent sprinting to go and score the agenda, which is a pretty crazy effect. And so whereas the NWE Sportsmetal list was using ice to tempo the runner, this Sportsmetal list is saying, I am going to build up something of a board, and you have to be able to disrupt this board, and Jeeves is 5 to trash, which is very expensive. So it's hard to keep up. And even if you do, you're not really disrupting my game plan of playing Audacities and Biotic Labors. And if you ignore the board, well, Jeeves and Nico Campaign are particularly quite good at making money and punishing the runner for leaving it. Marilyn is fine at making money and is a very important card in the list, but not quite as wildly strong as Nico Campaign if it fully unloads. And then, the subliminal messagings are very cute. They mean that if you get diversion down to 0, subliminal, you can play clicklessly, gives you a credit. And then you can do stuff with red level clearance to clicklessly gain another credit. And now all of a sudden, you are like 1 card away from fast advancing to win the game from 0 credits, which is really, I think, kind of cool. And so we can see both the NWE and the Snare Bear sports lists. They're working on the same idea. I didn't mention NWE because they dropped on Audacity at a Biroid work crew, which combos well with red level clearance to also fast advance agendas, though it's a little more expensive because it costs 2 and it can be trashed if the runner steals it or accesses it from hand or the deck. But both of these are basically trying to say, well, if I want to beat 419, I could either try and be better at 419 at 419's game of building up incremental value, or I can go in a different direction where I say, make all the value you want. Your money, is not going to do that much for you. My ice isn't that expensive. It's just there to cost you time that you would rather be accessing cards. And anytime you do access cards and you do steal an agenda, I get to see 2 new cards from that. And it's reasonably likely, with agendas being almost 1/4 of the deck, that I'll see a new agenda over the 3 cards I see, the 2 I draw and the 1 for mandatory draws, that I'll be able to just keep scoring through the runner stealing, and I have so many more points available to me from scores than the runner does that I can win that way. So that's why the Sportsmetal emerges as kind of this cool power pick, because everyone switches over to 419 to beat Precision Design, and then Sportsmetal nicely preys on 419. Now, the Sportsmetal list also turns out to be quite good against some of the other top meta decks. It doesn't care that much about Apocalypse, which is one of the other big things people were running to beat Precision Design. It doesn't really build a board state, or it invests very minimally in a board state, and mostly fast advances from hand. And so the standard Apocalypse decks didn't have a lot of tools. Similarly, the Hivemind Max deck can have play against Sportsmetal, but it becomes very draw order dependent. The Hivemind Max deck basically has to find an imp pretty quickly to start trashing the Audacities and Biotic Labors, and even potentially trashing agendas it accesses instead of scoring them, so that the Sportsmetal ID doesn't get those extra triggers. And so now I want to finish this up by talking about how you could think about, if this is a deck you want to beat, how you want to think about beating it. And so the first place to start is actually going back to that Worlds. And we can actually see Limes, who basically built a runner deck that countered his Corp deck. And the idea was, I'm just going to imp all day. And so this is really good against sports, because instead of stealing agendas, you can throw them in archives and force the Corp to spend recursion tools on their agendas rather than on their fast advance tools, which they would rather be, fast advancing more than they would be putting agendas back. And you can trash their Audacities and their Biotic Labors and whatever other stuff they're doing. So Imp is a really key card. I am trying out Carnivore. Obviously, no one else is or probably should be, though I do think if you're expecting a lot of Sportsmetal, Carnivore is great because a lot of the cards in your deck already don't matter, and so Carnivore turns those cards that don't matter into a valuable resource for you. And so you can go hardcore into this sort of, I'm going to play Imp, I'm going to play Stargate, maybe I'll play Friday Chips, just keep that Imp going forever. You can play the Carnivore, but you don't have to go this hard, right? You can also do some slightly more subtle things. One thing that the Snare Bears did in their 419 list that they were preparing for Fight Night to help against Sportsmetal is playing a card like Legwork. Because, I talked a lot about how single accessing and stealing an agenda against Sportsmetal is generally not great for the runner, because it actually gives Sportsmetal access to more cards. It lets them draw twice. Legwork allows the runner to, if they steal an agenda with one of the early accesses on legwork, they'll have an opportunity to steal again on the same access. So legwork is particularly good for this because agendas will build up in HQ to some degree as Sportsmetal tries to find tools to go and score them all out. And so legwork allows you to get a juice of accesses all at once. You could maybe think about something like the Maker's Eye if you're in Shaper. And we've also started seeing some Anarch decks playing Wanton Destruction, putting more pressure on HQ, forcing the Corp to protect HQ and treat the cards in their hand as a resource. And both Wanton Destruction and Legwork fit nicely into good decks that already exist. And so generally the best advice when you're like, oh, there's this new rogue deck, is to make the smallest possible adjustment to your deck that's is going to give you a little bit more advantage. That said, the tricky thing with both Legwork and Wanton Destruction is that they're not very, and actually even with the Imp solution, is those cards don't do that much against Precision Design. So every Precision Design list basically has just a couple of key cards, notably Anoetic Void and Managarm Skunkworks. This list has Fairchild 3 this banned, but it's able to fit ice around that very easily. And so when you, if you're like on the Imp, I'm going to trash everything plan, or the Carnivore, I'm going to trash anything plan if you're a masochist like me, there's just not that many high value trash targets. Like trashing a Bran, the Precision Design goes, okay, I've got plenty more ice where that came from. You trash a Seamless Launch, they go, that's okay, I can probably advance in a different way. You know, trashing a Tranquility Home Grid, it's a support card. It's an important card, and it's a good one to be in the deck, but you're not going to make them lose because you trash this. And Wanton Destruction has sort of the same problem, where Hasbiroid's hand isn't that valuable, except for firing off the Anoetic Void, but usually they only need to be able to fire it once to actually stop you from getting in the remote, because of how Managarm Skunkworks stacks with Anoetic Void. And finally, Legwork, the last card I talked about as like a good anti-sports tool, suffers a little bit because this Precision Design list often just starts, as soon as it draws an agenda, throws it in the scoring remote with an understanding that it will most likely be able to score it a lot of the time. And so there's just not going to be many games where agendas build up in hand. Now, that all said, I don't think that means don't run Legwork, don't run Wanton Destruction, don't run Imp. All of those are still good cards, and you want to be able to have a reasonable game plan against, at the very least, both this Precision Design list and one of these sports lists. Because these are the top 3 decks in the meta, at least as far as I can see. And I think hopefully in my next video I'll be talking with some other people about what they think the standard meta looks like going into Continental season. But you know, these are going to be the decks to beat, and the decks that we expect to be at the top of the field. And most other Corp decks are going to be somewhat sort of responding to the runner responses to these decks. And so when you're thinking about deck building, think about what these decks do and how your deck is going to respond to the different threats, and what's the smallest adjustment you can make to your ideal deck to handle all of these. The nice thing actually about both this Precision Design list and the Sportsmetal list is there's not a lot of bluffing in these lists, so it's pretty easy to play against yourself. Particularly the sports list, you can run it with a incredibly simple algorithm of, do I have agenda? If I do, score agenda. If not, put down some money or draw a threat, or its game plan should be fairly obvious, and then you can focus on your runner deck to try and think about, okay, how do I respond to this obstacle that sports is presenting me? The trickiest thing is when, you know, you're flooded as sports and trying to not, think about it as a runner and go, okay, how could I recognize that I was flooded without having this foreknowledge of flooding? Of course, the best solution is to play against someone else, but if you can't play against someone else, both the Sportsmetal list and the Precision Design list are worth playing so that you learn how to play them. And then once you feel like you can play them reasonably, they're decks that are fairly easy to pilot against yourself without making decisions that you feel like are reliant heavily on your knowledge that you get from playing both sides against yourself. So as you're getting ready for Continentals or just trying to dip your toe into Standard, this Sportsmetal list is something you should be aware of and something you should be planning for. Hopefully this video was useful, and I think that's going to be it for me. Thanks for sticking around. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. It helps me keep my morale up and keep going. So